On the 11th of January 1964, reporters gathered in Washington as the United States government released a document capable of breaking one of the most successful illusions in modern history. It was not a ban. It was not a criminal indictment. It was something more dangerous to an empire built on smoke, an official report concluding that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer in men and was the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. Outside that room, cigarettes were still sold as confidence, adulthood, glamour, and relief. Inside it, evidence from more than 7,000 scientific articles had been reduced to a verdict ordinary people could understand. But the crisis had not begun in 1964. It began centuries earlier, when a plant used within the ceremonial traditions of indigenous communities was removed from those limits, planted across colonial land, cultivated through controlled labor, mechanized, advertised, and eventually defended by corporations accused of deceiving the public. A cigarette looks small enough to disappear in a few minutes. The system required to make it ordinary took centuries to build. So how did one leaf become powerful enough to pull empire, slavery, science, and addiction into the same story? Before tobacco was sold across oceans, it could be placed in the palm of an elder. Among the Leech Lake Ojibwe, offering tobacco was and remains a way of asking for knowledge, permission, or blessing. Before harvesting wild rice, a person might place a small amount of tobacco as an offering, not payment for a commodity, but recognition that taking something from the land created an obligation. The gesture imposed a limit. You did not simply take because you could. Picture the scene before the canoes enter the rice beds. The water is still. Wooden poles rest across the boats. A small quantity of tobacco is set aside before the first stalk is bent. The valuable object is not measured by how much smoke it can produce. Its value lies in the relationship it acknowledges. Elsewhere, tobacco carried different meanings. Among Carolina Algonquian communities, the plant they called upowok appeared in religious practice and medicine. Across parts of the plains, pipes could mark diplomacy, trade, preparations for war, rites of passage, or relations with the spirit world. Bowls, stems, tobacco, and other sacred objects might be protected together in bundles. The familiar phrase, peace pipe, flattens all of this into one convenient image. There was no single indigenous tobacco culture. Just as there was no single indigenous nation, there was also no modern cigarette. The plants themselves could differ. The preparation could differ. Tobacco might be smoked, offered, exchanged, or used medicinally. What mattered was the structure around it. Who could use it, when, for what purpose, and under whose authority. In those settings, tobacco was not an endless background habit. It belonged to a relationship with a community, an elder, a ceremony, the land, or powers beyond the visible world. An early European observer watches smoke rise from a pipe. He sees the leaf. He sees the flame. He sees people inhale and exhale. He may record the object, copy the action, and carry dried leaves back toward the coast. But he cannot pack the entire meaning into a ship's hold. That was the first reduction in tobacco's global history. European merchants and travelers encountered a plant embedded in many different systems of knowledge, then carried away the part that could move most easily. The material itself. The rules did not travel as efficiently. Neither did the obligations, the languages, or the relationships that made the plant intelligible. Soon, tobacco would be described in European courts as a medicine, a curiosity, a vice, and a source of revenue. Those labels would conflict with one another. But they shared one important feature. Europeans were now deciding what the plant meant. A leaf that had been offered could now be priced. A practice that had belonged to specific communities could now be imitated by strangers. And once tobacco crossed the Atlantic, the central question changed. It was no longer only how people should use the plant, it was who would control it. Europe's first great misunderstanding was to assume that anything this strange must also be medicine. In the middle of the 16th century, dried tobacco leaves and seeds began moving through ports, courts, gardens, and medical books. The plant arrived carrying the authority of distance. It came from lands Europeans described as new, through sailors and diplomats who could offer fragments of indigenous knowledge but rarely its full context. That made tobacco easy to reinvent. At the French court, Jean Nicot, an ambassador stationed in Portugal, promoted powdered tobacco as a remedy. Stories spread that it could relieve headaches. His name would eventually survive in the botanical genus Nicotiana and in the word nicotine. The association was almost too perfect. A courtly messenger, an exotic plant, and a remedy that produced an immediate physical sensation. In Seville, the physician Nicolas Monades gave tobacco an even larger reputation. His writing, published in the 1570s and translated into English, praised the plant for complaints ranging from headaches and wounds to fatigue. Readers did not need laboratory trials or controlled studies. Early modern medicine worked through older theories of the body, personal testimony, inherited authority, and observation. A plant that made a person sneeze, sweat, cough, or feel suddenly alert appeared to be doing something powerful. In a noble household, a small box of powdered leaf arrives. The lid opens. A pinch is lifted toward the nose. The user sneezes, eyes watering, while someone nearby explains that the reaction proves the remedy is working. Tobacco is expensive, foreign, and forceful. Those qualities do not make it suspicious. They make it impressive. But the plant escaped the medicine cabinet. Pipe smoke appeared in taverns, streets, homes, and royal courts. People used tobacco because it was fashionable, social, stimulating, and increasingly familiar. Its popularity grew faster than the institutions trying to explain it. What had entered Europe as a supposed cure was becoming a habit. That transformation alarmed James I of England. In 1604, the king published a counterblast to tobacco. He attacked smoking as offensive to the senses, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. He compared its dark fumes to smoke rising from a bottomless pit. The argument was medical, moral, and political. To James, English people were imitating a foreign custom, wasting money, fouling rooms, and behaving as if repetition could turn foolishness into respectability. In one London room, the pamphlet is read aloud, while a clay pipe is already passing from hand to hand. The king controls the language of condemnation. He does not control the appetite. James attempted to suppress consumption through an enormous increase in the duty on imported tobacco. Demand endured. The contradiction became difficult to hide. Tobacco could be condemned as poison while remaining valuable precisely because people continued to buy it. The crown could denounce the smoke and charge heavily for every pound that entered the kingdom. This was tobacco's first major European victory. It did not need rulers to approve of it. It only needed enough users to make control profitable. Once governments learned that craving could become revenue, the argument changed. The question was no longer whether tobacco should exist in Europe. It was who would tax it, license it, import it, and eventually control the land where it grew. For England, the answer would soon be found across the Atlantic. Jamestown did not find gold in the ground. It found something more useful growing above it. By 1611, the English settlement on the James River had already survived hunger, disease, violence, and years of disappointing its investors. The Virginia Company had promised profit. What it had delivered was a fragile outpost consuming supplies faster than it created wealth. Colonists searched for minerals, timber, silk, and other exports, but none offered the dependable market the colony needed. Then John Rolfe began experimenting with tobacco. The local tobacco grown by Virginia Indians was familiar to the English, but many European smokers considered it too harsh. Rolfe obtained seeds of Nicotiana tabacum, associated with Spanish-controlled regions of the Caribbean and northern South America. By 1612, he was cultivating the milder leaf in Virginia. Samples reached England the following year. The first shipments were modest. Their meaning was not. In London, a merchant opens a package from a colony best known for starvation and failure. Inside is a cured brown leaf that can compete, however imperfectly, with tobacco sold through Spanish trade. It is light enough to cross an ocean, expensive enough to justify the voyage, and addictive enough to create returning customers. In 1617, Virginia sent roughly 20,000 pounds of tobacco to England. A year later, the amount had doubled. Settlers planted it wherever they could between buildings, along streets, and across new fields beside the James. The colony had finally found the export its investors wanted. Tobacco did not simply rescue Jamestown. It reorganized the settlement around itself. Every stage required coordination. Seedbeds had to be prepared. Plants had to be tended, harvested, cured, graded, packed, and transported. Barrels known as hogsheads were rolled toward rivers and loaded onto vessels bound for England. Merchants extended credit against future crops. Imported tools, cloth, furniture, and other goods returned across the Atlantic. A planter could owe money in London before the next leaf had even been cut. In a colony short of reliable coin, tobacco also began acting like money. A merchant might record a debt in pounds of leaf. Public charges, rents, and private purchases could be valued in tobacco. The crop was not only something Virginians sold, it became a measure through which other things were priced. Beside a warehouse ledger, a planter studies two columns. One column records tobacco delivered. Another lists cloth, iron tools, or household goods received on credit. His fortune is not sitting in a chest of silver. It is drying in barns and packed inside wooden hogsheads. If the crop spoils, if prices fall in London, or if a ship is lost, the numbers on the page can turn against him. Success created another problem. Everyone wanted to plant more. Tobacco exhausted soil, encouraging growers to clear new fields rather than remain on the same ground. Larger harvests required more land and more labor. The headright system rewarded those who financed migration with acreage, helping powerful planters accumulate property while settlement expanded along the rivers. Colonial authorities also attempted to regulate quality and prevent worthless leaf from damaging Virginia's reputation abroad. The landscape began to change. Forests were cut, fields widened. Warehouses appeared near waterways. Ships arrived with manufactured goods and departed with compressed leaves. What looked like agricultural prosperity was becoming dependence on a single crop. The colony needed tobacco prices to remain high. Planters needed merchants to keep extending credit. Investors needed ships to keep crossing the Atlantic. The Crown needed customs revenue. Even ordinary transactions increasingly depended on the next harvest. Virginia had survived its first crisis by finding something Europe wanted. But the solution created a harsher demand of its own. Every new field had to be cleared. Every plant had to be handled repeatedly. Every hogshead required human labor before it could roll toward the river. Tobacco had become the colony's wealth, its credit, and much of its future. Now Virginia needed enough controlled hands to keep that future growing. Tobacco's darkest transformation did not happen in the pipe. It happened in the field. A tobacco plant could not simply be sown and forgotten. Its seeds were almost dust. They were scattered across carefully prepared beds, protected through the cold months, and watched until the seedlings were strong enough to move. Then workers carried them into the fields and planted them one by one. That was only the beginning. A laborer in Virginia moves down a row beneath the summer sun. He bends toward each plant, clears weeds from its base, and turns over a broad green leaf. A tobacco hornworm clings underneath, large enough to strip away valuable growth. There is no machine coming behind him. The insect is removed by hand, and the worker moves to the next plant. The same row will demand him again. When flowers appear, they must be broken off, so the plant sends more energy into its leaves. New side shoot suckers must also be removed. The crop rewards repetition. Every plant is handled many times before harvest, and every missed task can reduce the planter's profit. During much of the 17th century, Virginia planters relied heavily on European indentured servants. A servant might cross the Atlantic in exchange for several years of labor, entering a contract that placed his or her time under a master's authority. The arrangement was temporary in law, but it could still be brutal in practice. Servants could be bought, sold with the remaining years of their contracts, punished, or have their terms extended. Women worked in the tobacco fields as well. So did children, convicts, indigenous captives, and Africans whose legal status in early Virginia developed unevenly before hardening into hereditary racial slavery. Tobacco did not create that transformation by itself. Colonial law, Atlantic commerce, racial ideology, land ownership, and political power all mattered. But tobacco supplied a relentless economic demand, fertile land and a workforce that planters could compel to return to the same plants, through the same exhausting sequence, season after season. By the later 17th century, Virginia's legal system increasingly defined Africans and their descendants as property for life. In 1662, the colony declared that a child's status would follow that of the mother, helping make enslavement hereditary. Unlike an indenture, enslavement did not expire after a fixed term. The colony had found a permanent labor system for a crop that continually demanded labor. At harvest, the work became heavier. Workers cut mature plants near the ground and carried them from the field. Inside the curing barn, the tobacco was hung from wooden poles, row above row. The leaves had to dry slowly enough to preserve their value. Too much moisture invited rot. Too much heat could ruin color and texture. Months of work could be damaged inside one dark building. Inside the barn's narrow light, an enslaved worker looks upward at hundreds of hanging plants. The crop belongs to someone else. The barn belongs to someone else. Even the worker's time and movement belong, under colonial law, to someone else. Yet the responsibility for protecting the harvest rests on the people denied any share of its freedom. After curing, leaves were stripped, sorted, bundled, pressed into hogsheads, and rolled toward rivers. The barrel concealed the field. By the time tobacco reached an English warehouse, the sweat, insects, repetition, and coercion had been compressed into a tradable weight. That separation changed the experience of everyone farther down the chain. A customer could light a pipe during an evening conversation without seeing the seedbed. A merchant could calculate profit without entering the curing barn. The Crown could collect customs duties without hearing the terms under which the labor had been extracted. The smoke appeared weightless because the work had been made distant. The plantation also demanded land. Tobacco depleted soil quickly under common colonial cultivation methods, encouraging planters to clear fresh ground. Farms spread along navigable rivers where hogsheads could be transported easily. That expansion increased pressure on indigenous territory and helped concentrate wealth and political influence among large landholders. By the end of the 17th century, tobacco profits supported a plantation order built from mutually reinforcing parts: land accumulation, racial law, forced labor, overseas credit, political office, and consumer demand. No single cigarette yet existed at the center of this world. Most tobacco was smoked in pipes, taken as snuff, or later rolled into cigars. But the essential structure was already visible. One person experienced the leaf as pleasure. Another experienced it as discipline. The plantation made tobacco profitable. It still could not make tobacco cheap, uniform, and abundant enough to reach nearly everyone. For that, the industry would need to replace the rhythm of human hands with the speed of a machine. The most important machine in tobacco history did not teach people to smoke. It made the world capable of supplying them without stopping. Before the 1880s, cigarettes were largely a handmade product. Skilled rollers shaped loose tobacco inside thin paper, repeating the same motion for hours. A factory could hire more workers or lengthen shifts, but production remained tied to the speed of fingers. In Durham, North Carolina, Duke, Sons and Company was already producing cigarettes by hand. Workers rolled them at long benches. Their labor created a valuable product, but every finished cigarette carried the time required to make it. James Albert Bonsack attacked that limit with gears, belts, paper, blades, and a continuous ribbon of tobacco. His machine fed shredded leaf onto a moving strip of paper. The paper curled around the tobacco to form a long cylinder. A blade then cut the moving roll into cigarettes of uniform length. Bonsack filed his patent application in September 1880 and received United States Patent number 238,640 on the 8th of March 1881. The drawings looked less like the future of desire than a dense mechanical puzzle. Most major manufacturers hesitated. The early machines could jam, tear paper, distribute tobacco unevenly, or produce cigarettes consumers regarded as inferior to hand-rolled ones. A fast machine that made unreliable products was not automatically a revolution. James Buchanan Duke saw a different calculation. In 1884, he committed his company to the Bonsack system. The decision reduced manufacturing costs and removed the ceiling imposed by hand production. By the late 1880s, Duke's company was producing millions of cigarettes per day. Inside the factory, the contrast is brutal. At one table, a roller aligns paper, spreads tobacco, shapes the cylinder, and completes another cigarette. Across the room, the machine pulls paper through metal guides in a continuous stream. The worker finishes one careful motion. The blade on the machine falls again and again. The machine did not become tired. It did not ask for higher wages. It did not need years of practice. It converted tobacco and paper into identical units at a pace that changed business economics. For workers, the change was immediate and threatening. A skill that had determined production could now be treated as an avoidable cost. Mechanization did not remove every human hand from the factory, but it changed which hands mattered and how much bargaining power they possessed. For Duke, cheaper production created a new problem. The factory could make more cigarettes than his existing customers were prepared to buy. That meant the next bottleneck was no longer manufacturing. It was desire. Duke cut prices, expanded distribution, and spent aggressively on advertising. Cigarette packages carried collectible cards featuring actresses, athletes, flags, military figures, and scenes from distant places. The card gave the buyer another reason to open the next package. A cigarette disappeared in smoke. A collection remained incomplete. A customer lays several cards across a table. One image is missing from the series. The easiest way to search for it is not to visit a gallery or order a print. It is to buy another package of cigarettes. The product and the promotion now reinforced one another. Duke committed an unusually large share of sales to advertising. He placed brand names where mass audiences would see them and used lower production costs to compete aggressively on price. Cheap cigarettes created more smokers. More smokers justified larger factories. Larger factories pushed the cost of each cigarette lower still. This was not simply efficiency. It was a commercial loop. In 1890, Duke joined with other major manufacturers to form the American Tobacco Company. The corporation consolidated enormous power over cigarette and smoking tobacco markets. The same year that the United States adopted the Sherman Antitrust Act, tobacco manufacturing was concentrating into one of the great industrial combinations of the era. 2 decades later, the Supreme Court would order the trust broken apart. But by then, the crucial transformation had already occurred. The cigarette had become standardized, portable, cheap, and available on a scale the hand-rolling era could never have sustained. The machine had solved the problem of supply. Advertising would solve the problem of meaning. The industry no longer needed to wait for people to decide that they wanted cigarettes. It could surround the cigarette with images, identities, and promises until smoking appeared to answer needs the factory itself had helped create. The cigarette had become cheap. Now the industry had to make it personal. The tobacco industry's greatest invention was not a cigarette. It was the smoker people wanted to become. By the early 20th century, factories could produce cigarettes in quantities unimaginable a generation earlier. The product itself was simple: shredded tobacco, thin paper, a brand name, and eventually a filter. There were limits to how much any company could alter the object without making it something else. So the industry changed the person standing beside it. In one advertisement, the smoker appeared as a disciplined man in uniform. In another, he was a successful businessman leaning back after a difficult decision. Later, he became a cowboy alone beneath an enormous sky. The cigarette remained nearly identical. What changed was the promise wrapped around it. Smoking could mean control. A soldier could light a cigarette during a pause, shielding the flame from the wind with both hands. One cigarette passed to another man could signal generosity, calm, or belonging. During major wars, cigarettes circulated through military supply systems, relief packages, canteens, and exchanges between soldiers. The association between smoking and endurance remained useful long after the battlefield disappeared from the advertisement. The message was not that the cigarette solved fear or exhaustion. The message was that the right kind of man already knew how to smoke through them. This was one identity the industry sold at scale: cigarette as proof of masculine composure. But half the adult population still represented a market restricted by social convention. For many women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, smoking in public could be treated as improper or socially aggressive. That boundary limited cigarette sales. It also created an opportunity. If the boundary could be redefined, consumption could be presented as liberation. Advertising connected the cigarette with the modern woman. City streets, employment, nightlife, sexual independence, and rejection of old rules. In 1929, a group of women smoked during New York's Easter Sunday parade in a publicity event framed for reporters as "torches of freedom," a phrase associated with public relations strategist Edward Bernays and American tobacco president George Washington Hill. On a crowded avenue, a woman lifts a cigarette as cameras turn toward her. To some observers, the act appears scandalous. To others, defiant. The product enters the scene disguised as a political symbol, yet the freedom being displayed had already been assigned a brand. That did not make women's struggle for independence unreal. It showed how quickly an industry could attach itself to that struggle and sell consumption as evidence of progress. A barrier to smoking was transformed into a reason to smoke. The same method worked with health. As medical concern grew, companies increasingly used reassurance. Advertisements featured physicians, athletes, singers, and people whose professions suggested authority. Some campaigns claimed that one brand was less irritating, smoother, milder, or preferred by doctors. Later, filters and low-tar language gave consumers a way to continue smoking while feeling they had made a more careful choice. An advertising table is covered with draft images. A doctor in a white coat occupies one page. A rugged outdoor figure replaces him on another. A fashionable woman appears on a third. The package changes color. The slogan changes tone. But the commercial problem remains the same. Identify a fear or desire, then place the cigarette beside someone who seems to have mastered it. The industry sold confidence to the anxious. It sold independence to people resisting social limits. It sold maturity to the young. It sold relief to workers whose breaks were short and whose days were long. This accumulated across magazines, radio, billboards, shop displays, films, and branded objects. Repetition made the cigarette familiar before many consumers were old enough to evaluate the promise attached to it. The cigarette became a portable costume. A person could hold it and borrow, for a few minutes, the identity surrounding the brand. But an identity built by advertising contains a trap. What feels like rebellion can still follow a script written in a corporate office. What feels like personal style can be repeated by millions shown the same image. By the middle of the 20th century, cigarette companies had made smoking appear woven into ordinary life. A cigarette could belong at a wedding, in a factory break room, beside a typewriter, inside a barracks, or in the hand of a doctor on a magazine page. Then the evidence began to gather. Doctors could be placed in advertisements. They could not permanently prevent hospitals, laboratories, and mortality records from revealing what repeated exposure was doing to the body. Advertising had made the cigarette personal. Science was about to make its consequences public. When the evidence became difficult to defeat, the tobacco industry discovered that it did not need to defeat it. It only needed to delay belief. In the first half of the 20th century, lung cancer changed from a relatively uncommon diagnosis into an increasingly visible medical crisis. Hospitals saw more cases. Death certificates accumulated. Pathologists found tumors in patients whose histories began to resemble one another. In 1950, Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill in Britain, and Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham in the United States, published major case control studies connecting cigarette smoking with lung cancer. They did not settle every scientific question in a single year, but they made one explanation increasingly difficult to dismiss. Besides stacks of patient records, a researcher compares one case with another. The names, occupations, and addresses differ, but one answer appears repeatedly in their smoking histories. The pattern is not visible in one body. It emerges only when hundreds of lives are placed beside one another. This was evidence the industry could not answer with a smoother slogan. In December 1953, leaders of major American tobacco companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York with the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. They faced a shared danger. If consumers accepted that cigarettes caused cancer, competition between brands would matter less than fear of the entire product. Their response appeared in newspapers in January 1954 as a frank statement to cigarette smokers. It promised support for impartial research while emphasizing that the alleged connection between smoking and lung cancer had not been proved. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee followed. The language sounded calm and scientific. That was precisely its power. The industry did not need to claim that every smoker was safe. It could point to unresolved details, demand more research, and present continuing controversy as a reason not to change. Scientific caution, normally a strength, could become commercial shelter. More evidence followed. Dole and Hill tracked thousands of British doctors. Researchers examined mortality, cigarette consumption, heart disease, bronchitis, and cancer. The case grew larger than any single hospital. Then, on the 11th of January 1964, reporters entered the State Department auditorium in Washington. Surgeon General Luther Terry had scheduled the announcement on a Saturday, partly to reduce immediate stock market disruption and maximize newspaper coverage. Each reporter received the report at the same time. The committee had reviewed more than 7,000 articles relating to smoking and disease. Its conclusion was no longer framed as a distant possibility. Cigarette smoking caused lung cancer in men, was a probable cause in women, and was the most important cause of chronic bronchitis. Pages turn across the room. No siren sounds. No factory closes. Cigarettes remain behind counters across the country, but one of the product's central defenses has broken. The federal government has placed its authority behind a causal conclusion. The industry adapted. Filters and words such as light, mild, and low tar offered reassurance to smokers who were worried but not ready to stop. The package suggested that danger could be managed by choosing another version of the same product, yet the numbers came from smoking machines, not human behavior. Smokers could take deeper or more frequent puffs, cover ventilation holes, or smoke more of each cigarette. A lower machine reading did not reliably mean a lower dose inside the body. Later reviews concluded that light cigarettes were no safer than regular cigarettes. The warning could now be acknowledged without requiring the customer to leave the market. A smoker could continue while feeling newly cautious. Over the following decades, lawsuits, congressional investigations, whistleblowers, and internal documents exposed more of the industry's conduct. The dispute was no longer only about disease. It was also about what companies knew, how they described nicotine, how they marketed supposedly safer products, and how they addressed youth, secondhand smoke, and addiction. In 1999, the United States government sued major cigarette companies under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. In 2006, a federal court found that the defendants had participated in a decades-long scheme to deceive the public. The findings covered health effects, nicotine addiction, light cigarettes, secondhand smoke, and marketing to young people. Years later, the companies were ordered to publish corrective statements in newspapers, on television, online, and eventually in retail stores. Decades later, a reader opens a newspaper and finds an advertisement purchased by a cigarette company. This time it does not promise glamour, freedom, or calm. It states that a federal court ruled the company had deliberately deceived the public. The advertising machine had been forced to speak against its own history. The industry had not needed to erase every fact. It needed to keep the public uncertain long enough for another cigarette to be sold, another habit to deepen, and another generation to enter the market. Evidence moved slowly because science had to be careful. Doubt moved quickly because it only had to sound possible. But while regulation tightened and smoking declined in some countries, the commercial system did not disappear. It moved, adapted, and found new packaging. The cigarette began losing its cultural authority before the nicotine business lost its customers. In many wealthy countries, smoking moved from offices, aircraft cabins, restaurants, and television screens toward designated corners and warning-covered packages. Taxes rose. Advertising disappeared from familiar places. Smoke-free laws changed what a room was expected to smell like. But decline was never the same as disappearance. Today, roughly 4 out of every 5 tobacco users live in low- and middle-income countries. The products may carry global brands, but the burden of illness and death falls most heavily in places with fewer resources for prevention, treatment, and enforcement. At the beginning of another season, a tobacco farmer studies the costs already waiting. The price offered for the cured leaf will be decided later. The costs arrive now: seed, fertilizer, fuel, borrowed money, and family labor. A damaged crop can trap the household in debt. In some tobacco-growing regions, children still work in fields where long hours, sharp tools, pesticides, heavy loads, and contact with wet leaves create serious risks. Nicotine can enter the body through the skin. A worker handling wet tobacco may become dizzy, nauseated, weak, or develop a severe headache, a condition often called green tobacco sickness. The finished package will display a polished logo. The person who touched the raw leaf may experience the product first as an occupational hazard. At the retail end of the chain, tobacco has been learning to look less like tobacco. A modern display may place traditional cigarettes beside heated tobacco sticks, electronic cigarettes, disposable vapes, and nicotine pouches. Some resemble pens, flash drives, or small pieces of consumer technology. Their surfaces are clean. Their flavors and packaging can distance them from the stale smoke, ashtrays, and warning images associated with cigarettes. These products are not identical, and their risks should not be described as identical. Burning tobacco remains extraordinarily harmful. Some non-combustible products may expose users to lower levels of certain toxicants than cigarettes, but lower exposure to some chemicals does not make a product harmless. Long-term effects differ by product and remain incompletely understood. The commercial continuity is easier to see. A company still needs repeated use. It still benefits when nicotine becomes attached to routine, stress relief, concentration, social belonging, or personal style. And it still has reason to present the newest package as a clean break from the object whose reputation has collapsed. A young customer turns a small electronic device over in one hand. There is no brown leaf, no flame, and perhaps no visible smoke. The design suggests novelty rather than inheritance. But the device has a history. Behind it are centuries of lessons about flavor, dose, convenience, branding, distribution, and the value of a customer who returns. The older product also leaves a physical inheritance after the smoke disappears. Cigarette filters are commonly made with cellulose acetate, a plastic. Trillions of cigarette butts are discarded every year, releasing microplastics and toxic residues into streets, soil, rivers, and coastlines. A cigarette burns for only a few minutes. The filter can remain after the smoker has walked away. The debt can remain after the harvest is sold. The illness can appear years after the advertisement has been forgotten. Tobacco did not escape its history by changing shape. It learned to present the next chapter as if the story had started again. Tomorrow, a cigarette may still look small. A paper tube, a filter, a few grams of tobacco. Something light enough to hold between 2 fingers and temporary enough to disappear before a conversation ends. But the history inside it is not small. Long before the reports, courtrooms, warning labels, and corrective statements, tobacco could be placed on the ground as an offering. Its meaning came from limits: who used it, when it was used, what obligation followed, and what relationship the act was meant to honor. Then the leaf began to move. It crossed an ocean and became medicine. It entered royal courts and became a vice. It reached Virginia and became credit, land, and colonial survival. It passed through the hands of servants and enslaved workers until labor disappeared inside wooden barrels. The machine changed the rhythm again. Tobacco was cut, rolled, wrapped, branded, and produced faster than human hands could manage. Once supply became nearly endless, the industry needed desire to become nearly endless too. So the cigarette learned to carry instructions. Be calm. Be strong. Be independent. Be modern. Take a break. Join the group. Choose the lighter version. Do not worry yet. When science challenged those instructions, doubt kept them alive. When smoke became harder to defend, nicotine found cleaner surfaces, new devices, and a language that sounded detached from the past. The plant did not create this system. It did not write the advertisements, design the machine, pass the plantation laws, suppress evidence, or decide that another generation of customers was necessary. People and institutions taught the leaf what to do. That is why the report released in Washington in 1964 mattered. It did more than describe disease. It interrupted a story the industry had spent decades teaching the public to believe. The interruption was not the ending. The package can change. The market can move. The smoke can become vapor, aerosol, or something hidden entirely. The old command can survive inside a new object. Return. Repeat. Buy again. Tobacco began as something offered within limits. Its modern power came from teaching the world to consume it without limits. The leaf was never born ordinary. An empire had to make it feel that way.